think about the history of engineering just for a second.
Right.
Like the entire philosophy behind building a machine, from, I don't know, the earliest water wheels to the most advanced robotics we have today, it's all rooted in one single concept.
Right. Problem solving.
Exactly. Problem solving. You build a water pump for a very specific reason. You just don't want to carry water up a hill in a bucket anymore.
Yeah, nobody wants to do that.
Right. So you design this piece of machinery, you install it, you turn it on, and the water moves. The problem is solved. And here's the crucial part of this. Once the problem is solved, you can just walk away.
Because it finalizes the task.
Yes.
I mean, in philosophical terms, the teleology of the machine, like its ultimate purpose or end goal, is to finish the job so completely that you never have to think about the job again. The machine's highest achievement is literally a state of rest.
Right, it achieves rest. But I want you, listening to this right now, to imagine a very different kind of machine. Yeah. Imagine a water pump whose entire power source, its funding, its maintenance contracts, and like the salaries of the people who operate it all rely on the absolute guarantee that the water never actually makes it to the top of the hill.
Wow. Okay.
Imagine an engine that only stays turned on if it continuously invents new leaks in its own pipes.
Well, in that scenario, the water pump completely ceases to be a tool for solving a problem.
Exactly.
It becomes an organism dedicated entirely to its own survival. And the only way it survives is by ensuring that the crisis it was built to solve becomes permanent.
Welcome to Discernment Drop. Today, we are putting that exact conceptual architecture under the microscope. We're going to map out the blueprints of a highly charged, profoundly intense cultural critique.
A critique that basically suggests we are currently living inside one of those self-perpetuating machines.
Right, and we should be really clear up front about what we're doing here today.
It is dense. It is unapologetic.
It's incredibly heavy. We are dissecting a piece by Pastor John L. Widdifield. It's titled, "The Perpetual Revolution, Why the Left is Never Done."
And it is a sharp piece of work.
It is. Now, to you listening, let's just establish the firm boundaries of our mission today. We are dealing with a text that contains intense, highly polarizing political and theological claims.
Right.
We are going to impartially map the mechanics, test the logic, and really explore the profound philosophical implications of his argument.
We're going to look the text directly in the eye and figure out exactly how the engine works.
Right. So to do that, we have to grasp the core premise that anchors this entire piece.
Which is quite a premise.
It really is. Pastor John argues that the modern progressive left is not actually attempting to solve societal problems, like at all.
Right. In his view, the movement is structurally designed to be a perpetual revolution.
A perpetual revolution.
Yes, it can never reach a resolution. Because actually solving the problems would instantly dissolve the power, the massive budgets, and the cultural authority of the people managing those problems.
I really want to dig into this idea, what we might call the economics of grievance. Because he states outright in the text, he says, they cannot afford to be done.
Which is such a striking way to phrase it.
It is. He paints this picture where if issues like racism, sexism, or, lack of inclusion were actually genuinely solved, if we somehow cross that utopian finish line tomorrow morning, a massive multi-billion-dollar apparatus would just instantly collapse.
And he is quite specific about who makes up that apparatus.
Yeah, who is he calling out here?
Well, he lists them out. The activist.
Yeah.
The bureaucrat. The diversity expert, the grifter. Right. If the problem vanishes, the activist loses the banner they march under. The bureaucrat loses the department budget they oversee. The expert loses the cultural authority to dictate terms to the rest of us.
It's all tied together.
It is. What Pastor John is really doing here is applying something called public choice theory to cultural activism, which is honestly a fascinating lens to use.
Okay, stop there for a second.
Sure.
Because for those of us who haven't taken a college economics course in a decade, you've got to break down public choice theory for us. What does that actually mean in plain English?
Oh, absolutely. So traditionally, we tend to think of government bureaucrats or activists as these purely public servants.
Right, like selfless heroes.
Exactly. People who only want what's best for society. They have no personal stakes.
Okay.
But public choice theory strips away all of that romanticism.
Okay.
It's an economic framework that says, wait a minute. Bureaucrats are human beings, and human beings are self-interested actors. Right. Just like a corporate CEO wants to maximize corporate profits, a government bureaucrat naturally wants to maximize their department's budget, their staff size, and their personal influence.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm tracking this. If I run, say, the Department of Pothole Repair for my city.
Very noble departments.
Very noble. But my ultimate incentive isn't actually to invent some indestructible asphalt that never, ever gets potholes.
No, definitely not.
Because if I do that, the mayor looks at my pristine roads, cuts my budget to zero, and I'm out of a job.
Exactly. You're unemployed.
So my actual incentive is to fix just enough potholes to justify my massive budget, but purposely leave enough unfixed to demand an increase in funding next year.
Precisely. You need a perpetual supply of potholes.
Wow.
And Pastor John is taking that exact economic mechanism and applying it to morality and culture. He's arguing that modern cultural activists function in the exact same way.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. If you run a massive NGO dedicated to fighting systemic bigotry, and society actually becomes demonstrably less bigoted, your funding is suddenly threatened.
You don't get invited to speak at universities anymore.
Right. You don't get the lucrative book deals. So structurally, in order to survive, you have to constantly find new things to categorize as bigotry.
Which perfectly explains the whole phenomenon of shifting goalposts that Pastor John spends so much time tracing in this piece.
Oh, he tracks it meticulously.
He does. He points out how the cultural messaging moved from something historically palatable, something like, just be kind or let people live how they want.
Which most people were totally fine with.
Right, most people agreed with that. But then it shifted to demands that are radically more invasive.
He notes the shift from asking for basic civic tolerance to demanding active, enthusiastic participation in highly controversial medical and social interventions.
Yeah, he brings up demands like chemically altering the puberty of confused adolescents, or forcing women to compete against biological men in sports.
And then, crucially, labeling the woman as cruel or a bigot if she raises even a mild objection about fairness or safety.
Right. And according to his framework here, this radical escalation isn't happening because society is somehow regressing into deeper hatred.
Not at all.
It's happening because the machine is literally starving for fuel. It's a pure institutional survival mechanism. Thinking about this, it reminds me of how subscription-based antivirus software operates.
Ooh, that's an interesting angle. How so?
Yeah.
Walk us through the mechanics of that analogy.
Well, think about their business model. If you buy a subscription to an antivirus software,
Right.
and that software permanently and flawlessly eradicates all malware from the entire internet forever, you are absolutely going to cancel your $60 monthly subscription.
Oh, instantly. I wouldn't pay another dime.
Exactly. The software company literally needs a constant, endless supply of new, slightly different, highly publicized viruses to justify its ongoing existence on your hard drive.
They have to keep updating the threat library.
Yes. If the internet is totally safe, the company goes completely bankrupt.
That is a very clean parallel, and Pastor John makes this point almost explicitly in the text.
Does he?
Yeah, he writes, the engine cannot run on truth because truth eventually lands somewhere. It has to run on grievance because grievance can be stretched forever.
Grievance can be stretched forever. That's a great line.
It is. Grievance is essentially the new malware that keeps the cultural subscription active.
But let's bring this down to the ground level, to the psychological reality of the average person living inside this system.
Okay.
If we accept his premise that a massive segment of our culture is built on managing grievances rather than curing them, what happens to the citizen?
That's the real cost here.
Pastor John argues that these ideological managers do not want order. They want supervision. They don't actually want moral clarity. They want moral dependency. That specific phrase, moral dependency, really jumped out at me.
Because it represents a profound shift in how a society operates.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what it actually means to be an autonomous, mature adult.
Right? You have to be able to make your own calls.
Exactly. Autonomy requires a stable foundation of reality. You trust your eyes, you trust basic biology, you trust your own conscience, and you navigate the world based on that.
Yeah.
But if the truth is constantly shifting, if the definitions of words, categories, and morality are updated daily by some invisible committee, you can't trust your own senses anymore.
You become completely paralyzed.
Yes. It creates a populace that is permanently infantile. If you are morally dependent, you have to constantly look over your shoulder to the expert or the HR department or the cultural bureaucrat to tell you what the current updated version of reality is before you even dare to speak.
You lose your autonomy.
Totally. And conveniently, the movement provides an endless supply of guides to hold your hand through the very confusion that they created in the first place.
And they charge you for the service.
Exactly.
Either in literal corporate consulting fees, administrative budgets, or, in social capital. But this brings up a real mechanical question about the engine itself. Well, if this movement functions as a self-perpetuating machine that has to constantly shift reality, what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how does it justify this constant movement?
That's a great question.
Pastor John argues it comes down to a fundamental structural difference between truth and lies.
Yes, he lays out a very strict epistemological framework here.
Right. And just to clarify, epistemology is just the philosophical study of how we know what is true.
Exactly. And he summarizes it with this really sharp piece of prose. He says, truth can stand still. A lie has to keep moving.
I really want to spend some time on that because, it sounds great on a bumper sticker.
It does.
But I want to understand the physics of it. What does he mean that reality naturally resists falsehoods?
Think about it like physical friction. When an ideology pushes a fundamental lie into the real world, it doesn't just float peacefully in the ether.
Yeah.
It collides with human nature. It collides with biology. It collides with the physical limitations of the universe. Pastor John argues that this collision inevitably creates what he calls collateral damage.
And he's very stark about what that damage looks like. He points to ruined bodies, ruined minds, and fractured families.
Exactly. Now, if the ideology were actually interested in truth, it would look at all that collateral damage and say, wow, our foundational premise was wrong. We need to stop right now.
But as we established with the whole water pump analogy, the machine cannot stop without destroying itself.
Precisely. Because the ideology cannot admit failure, it has to invent a new lie to explain away the disaster of the previous one. It's like a compounding interest of falsehoods.
Wow. Let me pull some specific contrasts he uses in the text to illustrate this, because he frames this entirely as a direct conflict between an ancient biblical truth and the modern progressive lie.
Yeah, let's hear them.
He writes, truth says, male and female, he created them. And then he contrasts it with the moving target. He says, a lie says, well, yes, but maybe, unless, except, however, depending on your internal weather report.
He is really highlighting the exhaustion of the qualifiers.
Yeah, it's exhausting just to read.
Truth is a period. The lie is an endless string of commas and asterisks.
That's a great way to put it. And here's another one that hits even harder. He writes, truth says, children are a heritage from the Lord. The contrast. A lie says, children are clay for ideological sculptors and pharmaceutical profiteers.
That rhetoric is incredibly aggressive.
It is, but it serves his larger point, right? That the definition of what constitutes harm must constantly widen until reality itself is viewed as offensive.
And that widening, again, is a feature, not a bug. If a lie has to grow to survive the friction of reality, then the ideology must constantly find new things to label as dangerous.
Right.
If biological reality, like the simple observable fact of male and female, contradicts the ideology, then the ideology cannot just ignore biology.
It has to attack it.
Yes. It must actively categorize basic biological reality as hate speech or violence. The lie must expand to completely consume the evidence against it.
But let me jump in here, because this raises a tactical question that I kept wrestling with while reading his framework.
Okay, what is it?
If truth is, as he says, entirely static, if its primary characteristic is that it stands still, doesn't that stillness make it a sitting duck?
Ah, I see what you're saying.
I mean, if you are standing completely motionless and a machine is constantly iterating, shifting its algorithms, and attacking you from 10 new angles every single day, doesn't the machine have the overwhelming tactical advantage?
It does look like a massive disadvantage on the surface, doesn't it?
It really does.
And Pastor John argues that this exact dynamic is why traditional institutions in the church often feel like they are constantly losing ground.
Right.
When truth stands still, it is reliable and unchanging, which is its ontological strength, like its core nature is solid, but socially and politically.
It looks boring.
Exactly. It makes truth appear unresponsive, flat-footed, and just boring in the face of a highly dynamic, aggressive, and frankly entertaining rhetorical campaign.
It's like a medieval fortress trying to fight a swarm of drones. Like, the fortress is made of solid rock, which is great, but it can't move.
That's a fantastic way to look at it. Pastor John's critique is that those defending the truth have mistakenly equated standing still with remaining passive.
Ah.
He is arguing that a fortress still requires active defenders on the walls firing back. The stillness of truth is its anchor. But if you just sit inside the walls and hope the drones eventually get bored and go away,
they won't.
No, the drones will eventually map every single weakness and starve you out.
And what's fascinating is that this relentless momentum doesn't just attack the fortress.
No, it doesn't.
An engine that runs that hot eventually burns whatever is closest to it. The machine, according to the text, inevitably turns its hunger inward.
Which brings us to the internal mechanics of the movement itself. Pastor John explores the concept of purity tests and what he calls the sacrament of accusation.
I found this part so interesting. He writes that the modern left always eats its own. It has to.
It has to. That's the key phrase.
Right. He makes the case that the revolution cannot possibly stop with old, traditional enemies. Yesterday's progressive ally is mathematically guaranteed to become tomorrow's reactionary bigot.
And to understand why, we really have to look at how he categorizes the movement. He doesn't treat the progressive left as a mere political coalition.
No, not at all.
He frames it explicitly as a religion.
A full-blown religion?
Yes, it has its own doctrines, its own original sin, which usually involves systemic privilege, and a priestly class of journalists, professors, therapists, and NGOs.
But he makes a very stark theological observation here. He calls it a bad, cruel religion.
Because it is missing the one mechanism that makes a religion survivable for human beings.
Which is?
It has no mechanism for forgiveness. It has no atonement. There is no cross to absorb the guilt. In the Christian framework that Pastor John is operating from, a healthy religion acknowledges that human beings will fail, but it provides a concrete mechanism to resolve that guilt.
Right. You sin, you repent, the debt is paid by Christ, and the ledger is cleared. You can actually rest.
The debt goes to zero.
Exactly. But Pastor John points out that this modern ideological religion runs purely on heresy hunts and shifting creeds. And because the creeds update constantly to sustain the revolution, there is literally no way to ever finally clear your ledger.
You can never do enough.
I want to make this tangible for the listener. Think about the psychological toll this takes on a normal person trying to navigate a modern corporate environment today.
It's exhausting.
We're talking about human beings kept in a permanent state of moral agitation. Picture a typical office worker on a corporate Slack channel. They genuinely want to be a good person. They aren't trying to hurt anyone. But Pastor John writes that to survive in the system, you must always be repenting, updating your language, checking your privilege, signaling submission.
It's a full-time job.
Right. Imagine living your entire life knowing that the rules of morality will receive a software patch overnight, and if you log into Slack tomorrow morning and fail to use the newly approved terminology, your career is over.
It creates an atmosphere of pervasive, low-level paranoia. In that corporate Slack scenario, you aren't actually acting out of a desire for virtue. You are acting out of a sheer terror of being unmasked as impure.
Yes.
That is an incredibly brittle, exhausting way to build a society. And here is where the sacrament of accusation comes into play.
Explain that.
Because there is no mechanism for actual forgiveness. The only way to prove your own purity, the only way to momentarily deflect the eye of Sauron, so to speak, is to find someone else to accuse.
So accusing your coworker becomes your only shield.
Yes. Denouncing someone else becomes the only valid currency to demonstrate your own righteousness. That is why the revolution eats its own. The demand for sacrifices literally never ends.
There is a very dry irony in how Pastor John lays this out. He uses these rapid rhetorical reversals to expose the absurdity of what the culture has accepted as normal.
He's very good at that.
He is. He says, the thing that was sold as inclusion became compelled speech. The thing sold as science became superstition with lab coats.
Ouch.
Right. It's a very sharp literary device.
Yeah.
He is systematically stripping the glossy marketing language away to show the raw mechanics underneath.
He is exposing a civilizational bait and switch. You were sold a package clearly labeled inclusion, but when you open the box, you receive compelled speech. You were sold objective science, but you received ideological dogmas enforced by people wearing lab coats. The packaging is completely divorced from the product.
But he doesn't stop at calling it a political bait and switch. He doesn't just say, hey, look at these hypocrites.
No, this is where the text escalates dramatically.
Yeah, he shifts the critique from the realm of sociology directly into metaphysics.
This is the absolute crux of the text. He states explicitly, this is not merely political stupidity, it is spiritual rebellion.
He describes the modern cultural movement as Babel with better marketing.
That's quite a phrase.
I really want to unpack that because it's a heavy accusation to make. What does the Tower of Babel have to do with modern HR pronoun mandates or gender ideology.
It's a deep theological connection. In the Genesis narrative, the Tower of Babel is the ultimate symbol of humanity attempting to build a structure to reach the heavens on their own terms.
Right.
It was an attempt to usurp God, to make a name for themselves independent of the Creator's design. Pastor John is arguing that the current cultural moment is not a surface-level debate over civil rights or healthcare policy.
It's much deeper than that.
It is a fundamental metaphysical rebellion where the creature is looking at the Creator and saying, "We will now take over the job of defining reality."
He writes, "We will decide what a body means. We will decide what a man is. We will decide what a woman is. We will decide what a child is." It's literally a war over the authority to name things.
And we have to understand that naming, both biblically and philosophically, is an act of total sovereignty.
How so?
Well, when Adam is placed in the garden and God tells him to name the animals, he is exercising delegated dominion. He is categorizing reality under God's authority.
Okay, I see.
When a modern ideology attempts to rename fundamental, observable, biological, and moral categories, Pastor John sees it as a direct usurpation of that authority. It is not a polite demand for coexistence in a pluralistic society. It is a demand for lordship.
I hear that, and the theological argument is sound, but I have to throw a flag here and push back on his rhetorical strategy just a bit.
All right, let's hear it.
Because as intense as this is, he does include a brief caveat in the text. He admits that not every individual marching under the progressive banner is a mustache-twirling villain intentionally trying to overthrow God. He acknowledges that many people are just deceived, they are overly sentimental, or, as he beautifully phrases it, they are catechized by the air.
Meaning they just passively absorb the beliefs of the culture around them without thinking too deeply about it. They think they're just being nice.
Exactly. So if so many of these adherents are just catechized by the air, if they are just following the cultural wind because they genuinely want to be kind, doesn't Pastor John's intensely aggressive rhetoric risk totally alienating them?
You think it's too harsh?
Well, he literally calls the movement a death cult with HR language. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a suburban mom who just put a generic "Be Kind" sign in her front yard because she doesn't want anyone in the neighborhood to feel left out.
Right.
If she hears her worldview called a death cult, her immediate human reaction is going to be defensive rejection. Does his militancy defeat his own goal of revealing the truth to people who are just confused? Is he just preaching to the choir here?
That is easily the most common critique of this kind of writing, and it's a vital question. But to understand his strategy, we have to look at what he's actually targeting.
Okay.
I don't think he is primarily attacking the internal intentions of the suburban mom. He is attacking the incentives of the system she has unwittingly aligned herself with.
Oh, I see.
He is arguing that her genuine human desire for compassion has been hijacked and weaponized by a machine that, in his words, despises the very people it claims to protect.
So he would argue that speaking softly to her about the machine is actually a disservice.
Yes. From his perspective, using soft diplomatic language to describe a machine that is actively crushing human beings is a form of cowardice.
Wow.
Think of it this way. If you see someone walking onto a bridge that you know is structurally compromised and collapsing,
Right.
you don't politely whisper to them about the engineering deficiencies so you don't offend the architect.
No, you yell.
Exactly. You yell at the top of your lungs to get them off the bridge. Pastor John believes the system's incentives, which reward the physical mutilation of children and the destruction of biological truth, are so thoroughly catastrophic that they require militant rhetorical clarity to shatter the illusion of niceness.
The suburban mom needs to be shocked awake.
Exactly.
And because that system is built entirely on those incentives, because it is an engine that feeds on expansion and consumption, he argues that attempting to appease it is a fool's errand.
Right, which leads us to the failure of compromise.
Yes. He insists the machine structurally cannot be satisfied. He writes, "Every concession has to become an admission that you owe them more. Every compromise has to become proof that resistance is evil."
What is fascinating about this section is how surgically it dismantles the entire concept of the third way, or, the moderate middle ground.
Yeah, the middle ground is completely gone in his view.
It is. For decades, the default stance of many traditional institutions, corporate boards, and especially many moderate churches has been a sort of polite accommodation.
Right. The strategy was always, we will give you this one word, we will alter this one category, we will change this one policy on pronouns, and in exchange, you'll leave the rest of our doctrine alone, and we can maintain civil peace.
But Pastor John says compromise is treated by this machine as an admission of guilt.
It's like attempting to negotiate with a black hole.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't throw a couple of small moons into a black hole and expect it to say, thanks, I'm full now, I'll stop pulling on your solar system.
Right, it doesn't work that way.
You cannot negotiate with physics. Its very nature dictates consumption. And the terrifying part is, the more mass a black hole consumes, the stronger its gravitational pull becomes. Every concession actually makes the machine stronger, not weaker.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanics he is describing. The text says, they think if they surrender one word, one locker room, one title, one pronoun, the beast will be satisfied. It will not, because it cannot.
It literally cannot.
As we established with the public trace theory model earlier, the ideology is funded by, organized around, and rules through perpetual dissatisfaction. To satisfy it would be to kill it. Therefore, it will never allow itself to be satisfied.
Which means the middle ground isn't just shrinking, it's completely scorched earth.
Yes.
And that leads Pastor John to issue what can only be described as a militant call to arms, a demand for absolute clarity from his readers.
His directives to the listener here are completely unsparing. He tells his audience to stop being naive, refuse emotional blackmail, protect children, defend women, and preach Christ as Lord over reality.
Refuse emotional blackmail. That is such a potent phrase because it so accurately describes the primary tactic of the culture war right now.
It really does.
He writes, you do not have to call cruelty kindness. You do not have to call mutilation medicine. He is actively giving his audience permission to reject the linguistic framing of the movement. He's saying, hey, you don't have to play their language games.
And he pushes even further. He says any ideology injuring children to sustain itself deserves to be crushed morally, publicly, and spiritually.
That word crushed.
Yeah, it's intense. It is a deliberate, sharp contrast to the modern therapeutic approach to faith, which prioritizes gentleness, empathy, and non-judgment above all else. He's drawing a hard, uncrossable line in the sand.
Here is the quote that I think will stick with people the most because it is so definitive. He says, a society that cannot define a woman is not advanced. It is judged. A church that cannot say these things clearly is salt that has lost its savor.
It is a devastating critique of institutional cowardice.
Absolutely.
He is arguing that defining basic biological reality is not some peripheral, secondary political issue that we can all just agree to disagree on. It is a fundamental test of a civilization's sanity and a church's basic faithfulness to the Creator.
Okay, but here is where the rubber meets the road, and I really want to push on the practical execution of this. Pastor John is demanding an end to vague niceness. He says we cannot answer civilizational derangement by becoming softer, blurrier, and more polite.
Right.
But put the listener in the room for a second. How does an average person actually execute this in the real world?
That's the hard part.
Let's go back to that corporate HR meeting. Or imagine sitting at a PTA conference where a radical new policy is being introduced. How do you execute this mandate of crushing the ideology without just sounding completely unhinged and immediately losing your job, your livelihood, and your ability to feed your family?
It's a huge risk.
He provides the theological mandate, absolutely. But the social execution is where the friction literally tears your life apart.
That is the exact tension, and it is incredibly difficult. The text implies that the fear of losing your job, your social standing, or your friends is exactly the leverage the machine uses to compel your compliance.
Right, the emotional blackmail.
The emotional blackmail works precisely because you are afraid of the consequences. While Pastor John doesn't give a step-by-step survival guide for an HR meeting, his framework suggests that the execution lies in calm, immovable refusal.
Okay, so what does that look like?
You don't have to scream. You don't have to flip a table. You simply have to say, no, I will not say that is true because it is false.
And then just let the chips fall where they may.
Yes. The friction is unavoidable. I think what he is telling his readers is that the era of frictionless, comfortable Christianity in the West is over. You either accept the friction of speaking the truth, or you accept the subjugation of living the lie. There is no third option anymore.
And that profound, stark choice leads us to the philosophical climax of his entire argument. He ends by contrasting the endless, frantic work of the revolution with the finished work of Christ.
This is where he pulls the entire socio-political critique back into a deep, resonant theological synthesis.
It's a brilliant contrast.
He contrasts the progressive left's implicit command, which is keep striving, keep accusing, keep evolving, keep apologizing, with Christ's final words on the cross, it is finished.
It is a brilliant structural contrast. He argues that the progressive system fundamentally cannot offer rest. It is mechanically impossible for it to offer peace because it lacks a mechanism for forgiveness.
Right.
It has no cross, it has no cleansing blood to wash the ledger clean. It only has, as he writes, more procedure, more compliance, more language updates, more experts, more accusation.
The synthesis here cuts to the core of the human condition. Systems built entirely on accusation eventually collapse under their own hunger because they burn through the sanity of their adherents.
It just exhausts people.
Exactly. The Christian worldview, as Pastor John presents it, offers actual rest and finality.
Okay.
Christ's work is perfect, therefore it is finished. The world's ideological work is fundamentally flawed, therefore it must be perpetual.
Think about the profound cultural exhaustion out there right now. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum.
Yeah, everyone is tired.
Even for those listening who might be entirely outside the church, who don't share Pastor John's theology at all. The appeal of a system that actually allows you to say, enough. A system where you can be forgiven, where the debt is permanently paid and you can finally step off the treadmill of moral panic, that is an incredibly potent psychological counteroffer to the endless cancellation and paranoia of modern culture.
It addresses the deep fatigue of our era. People are tired. They are tired of the permanent crisis. They are tired of the permanent guilt. Pastor John is tapping into that deep structural exhaustion and offering a metaphysical exit ramp.
It really highlights the ultimate irony of the terminology we use, a movement that brands itself as progressive, a word which literally implies moving forward toward a final destination, is, according to the mechanics of this text, doomed to eternally run in place, fueled only by panic and grievance.
It's a treadmill dressed up as a highway.
That's exactly what it is, and that ultimately is the architecture of Pastor John's critique.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
So let's pull all of this together and look at the map we've drawn. We have taken you on a genuinely intense, winding intellectual journey today. We started by dissecting the economics of grievance, exploring how cultural problems are structurally incentivized to become permanent industries through public choice theory.
Right.
We unpacked the pathology of the moving lie, looking at how falsehoods must endlessly expand to cover up their own collateral damage while truth stands still. We explore the psychology of purity tests, the terror of the corporate Slack channel, and the sacrament of accusation.
The eating of their own.
Yes. And finally, we explored a profound theological critique that elevates this entire cultural conflict from a political disagreement to a metaphysical war over who holds the sovereign authority to name reality itself.
We promised at the beginning to look the argument in the eye, to explore its structural depths without flattening it into safe, generic talking points, and I believe we've done that.
I think we have.
Regardless of where you stand, Pastor John has built a formidable, aggressive piece of cultural architecture that demands a response.
It absolutely does. But before we let you go, we want to leave you with one final, unaddressed, philosophical question to chew on as you go about your day. Something that builds on everything we've discussed, but looks out at the broader horizon of our civilization.
It's a big one. If a secular society actively, intentionally dismantles the traditional religious mechanisms for forgiveness, for atonement, for definitively clearing the moral ledger, what happens to the innate, inescapable human need to be absolved?
That need doesn't just go away.
No, it doesn't. Will we always, inevitably, invent a new, infinitely more punitive religion to take its place? And ultimately, can any civilization survive permanently on the fuel of accusation?
That might just be the defining question of our era. Thank you for walking through these heavy, muddy waters with us. Thank you for your time, your focus, and your willingness to engage with challenging ideas. We will see you next time on Discernment Drop.